Hello and welcome to Advocata's Reset Now podcast. Your host for today is me, Avishka, and I'm joined with Yohan Lawrence, our guest speaker for today. Yohan has over 20 years of experience in high-level positions in the management of apparel businesses. He is currently the Secretary General to the Joint Apparel Association Forum, where he previously worked as the Vice Chairman. He has also been the Chairman of the Sri Lanka Apparel Exporters Association and served as an industry director at the Sri Lanka Institute of Textile and Apparel, as well as being a member of the Sri Lanka Export Development Board Apparel Advisory Committee. Today, he joins us with all his expertise to talk about reducing barriers to export. Yohan, it's a pleasure to have us here.
Thank you, Avishka, and thank you for asking me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. I think before we jump into kind of talk about the barriers, something that has come up, and the President himself mentioned quite a lot in his speech, is this need to kind of move towards an export-oriented economy. Considering kind of what led us into this crisis and our situation today, what are your thoughts on kind of this transition and this move?
So it's something which we fundamentally agree with. I mean, if we look at the economy of the country and we look at where we are and what we need to get ourselves out of it, exports is an absolute key, and merchandise exports in particular, because there's a difference between merchandise and service exports, and so merchandise exports all go through Custex, exports documents come in and out. It's completely traceable. It's completely realizable in terms of what this is. So Sri Lanka's merchandise exports are currently around sort of $10 to $12 billion, I think. And against that, I think all economists and experts are saying that figure really needs to get to about a 20 billion figure. So for Sri Lanka to really make the transition, we are going to have a massive increase in exports. And as you rightly pointed out, this is reflected in the president's strategy for the country, which is an export strategy, and that looks at protecting existing markets and then also going into new markets in terms of both product diversification and physical new markets. So we're very much on board. We believe that is absolutely key, and the sooner we can get moving on that and see active, real progress, the better we will be.
Yeah, so I think one aspect of improving our export-oriented markets, improving our export, would be kind of seeing how we can reduce the barriers they face. Could you perhaps give us just like a general overview of right now what are kind of the main barriers, main issues that exporters face when they try to access these foreign markets?
Sure. So if you look at our apparel export base, it's predominantly focused around three areas: the US, the EU, and the UK. Those three markets account for something of the order of about 85% of our of our apparel exports. Of the balance, a lot of the stuff that goes to other countries is actually what brands are asking us to ship directly. So, for example, there's companies working for an international sportswear brand, and they say, okay, can you send these orders to Australia, these to China, and so on. So that 85% is actually probably an understatement. It's actually really probably more than that. What we've found, though, is that even in these markets, and if you take the EU and the UK, because those are the two markets where Sri Lanka currently has some form of preferential market access through the GSP Plus and the UK's DTCS schemes. Sri Lanka is restricted because the utilization on apparel is only around 50%, which means, broadly speaking, for every $100 worth of apparel you export, only $50 of those qualify for the status. By contrast, countries like Bangladesh, who are an LDC and obviously work on a different scheme, automatically everything qualifies. So one of the issues that we find, if you take last year, the year that's just done, Sri Lanka's apparel exports grew by about 10%. And however, in the same period, countries like Bangladesh have grown 23, 24, 25%. So what this actually means is that countries like Bangladesh, I'm using that as an example because they have unrestricted market access, are literally just taking markets away from us. So in terms of being able to grow into new markets, then the same argument applies, is that if we don't have some form of preferential market access, some sort of free trade agreement, then Sri Lanka is going to be disadvantaged. Right now, if you look at from a country perspective, our competitors, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Vietnam, all of these countries have fairly advanced free trade agreements with other nations. Vietnam is a classic case. If you look at Vietnam's export growth and how that's connected to the number of FTAs that it's signed, it's, for us to be able to grow our exports and to grow significantly, because for us to come out of this crisis, we really have to have a quantum leap in the numbers we're exporting. That the sort of generic growth of a few percent here and there is just not going to cut it. So unless you have something that's going to not actually give you an edge over a competitor, but bring you on even terms, because right now our competitors are also going into these markets and they're already negotiated themselves a point of market access. So unless we're able to get onto that same bus, as it were, we will just find ourselves left behind. So from an apparel perspective, we can't underscore enough how important it is that we get some form of market access into these markets. And that's, as I say, to reiterate, that's just to put us on a level playing field, not to give us a particular advantage over a competitor.
Yeah, so just to follow up with that on the whole topic of FTAs, I think there have been recent discussions in terms of FTAs with Thailand, China, but there hasn't seemed to be much in terms of focusing once again on the EU, the UK. So in terms of your area of expertise, do you think we need to also redirect some of our efforts into, I think, bringing, especially the UK, now since they've left EU, they've been looking to form those FTAs, make those connections. Do we need to push more there? Or do we also have perhaps an opportunity in maybe even joining one RCEP or the CTTP, one of these regionals, and maybe unlocking a potential for exports in the East Asian and Southeast Asian market?
So I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think they have to happen. I think this issue of exports is, we have to protect and grow our existing markets. You're not going to make a quantum leap by in new markets. So yeah, in terms of the UK, and you're absolutely right. Post Brexit, the UK is actively signing free trade agreements with a number of countries, so right now, Bangladesh, they don't need to because they have their own DCTS scheme, which is unlimited access. But the India, for example, is in advanced discussions. And if we don't get our act together there, and when somebody like India gets unrestricted duty-free access, the size of their capacity as against us, they will literally just have us for breakfast. So absolutely, I think, the UK is a prime example. Particularly, again, I come back to the fact that the DCTS scheme, which is in place, unfortunately only allows for about 50% of our exports to be to qualify. And we're not really able to make a big leap there because that comes from the rules of origin under the scheme. And so unless the scheme is altered, because Sri Lanka is not a fabric base. We don't have the land, we don't grow cotton, we don't have the resources. So yes, we will grow our fabric base bit by bit, but we're never going to become a major fabric player. And that's going to restrict our ability to get the full benefit of these schemes. So yeah, absolutely. The UK is a key one because, as you rightly said, post-Brexit, the mood from their perspective is very positive, and we should be pushing that. At the same time, yeah, I agree. Things that, and you talked of RCEP, and I think countries that we've identified as being important certainly include places like Australia and Japan, both of whom are members of the RCEP. We also think Canada is also an important one. It's a growing market for us statistically. We've managed to increase our level of our exports to Canada, and Canada again is right now in the process of opening a window of opportunity for their GPT scheme, which is sort of like the GSP Plus scheme. So there's an opportunity for Sri Lanka to go into these. And again, I think because of the fact of how important these are in terms of Sri Lanka's recovery, there's an argument to be made that there is an urgency to do this, if nothing else, for these countries to help Sri Lanka get its recovery back on track, because if we don't do that, we're not going to recover. So, yeah, I don't think the two, coming back to your original question, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. We should be looking both at protecting and growing our existing markets, and then also looking at new markets and looking to see where we can have market access into those markets.
Yep, I think definitely that's some good perspective brought in, but I think when we speak about free trade agreements, I don't know whether it's political or not, but you always have a lot of almost a bias against it and almost misconceptions. So, do you think there will be enough like political will capital to kind of push this on all fronts internally for us to kind of get it done?
I think politically the will is there. I think it's been declared as a goal, as vision and strategy of the government. So I think it is there. But you're absolutely right. They're viewed with, with a great deal of skepticism. And our take on this is this: if we want to trade with the world, and we know it's established beyond all reasonable doubt that we have to accept that the world will want to trade with us. You cannot go into this. It's not a one-way street where we can go to countries and say, hey, we want to export to you, but thanks, we don't want your exports. It just doesn't work. And at the end of the day, if you do have that protectionist layer, then the person who loses out is actually the domestic consumer. And right now we need to make sure that at a time of economic crisis, we're doing everything to make life easier for the domestic consumer and to have protectionism in place that just takes away, makes the customer pay more, is fundamentally the wrong thing. I do agree there are certain sensitive industries that may need a certain amount of protection, but that has to be for a very limited period of time because, companies would presumably always be wanting to look to export, and companies who predominantly sell locally and are afraid of an FTA. My argument would be you need to look at it the other way, as the FTA being an opportunity to open the world to you. So rather than being saying, well, this massive market is going to flood my local market, it's saying, well, hang on a second, guys, I can suddenly sell to this massive market. So I think it requires a bit of a mindset. There's always you're absolutely right. There's sort of a mental mind block over it. A lot of people talk, saying, what's the analysis? Will it work? What? And if you take the ISFTA, which is a limited free trade agreement with India that offers that's in place currently, Sri Lanka uses it a lot more than India does. So there's an example of something that's right under our nose happening right now, where actually Sri Lanka exports more to India under the FTA than we import. So the evidence is there. The case study of Vietnam and how it's grown is there. The evidence is all there to say that these will work. And again, I think for Sri Lanka, because we're such a small player on the global scale of things, again, I can only talk apparel. Apparel, we're somewhere between 1% and 2% of global trade. So if we doubled it, it's really not going to eat into any, people almost wouldn't notice if we doubled it, in terms of the global scale. And if we could take apparel from 5 billion to 10 billion, the impact that would have on the country, on employment, on rural employment, because a lot of our factories are right across the country. So the multiplier effect happens in different locations, not primarily in Western Province. So the benefits are huge. And yes, in this scheme of things, you will have winners and losers, and we need to remain in industries that we can compete in internationally, because that's the long-term sustainable business model that also protects the customer, that the domestic customer who's buying goods. So if we remain in industries which can compete internationally, that means that benefit can also be made available to the local consumer.
Yeah, I think that point you brought on, the need for like a perspective shift, especially kind of looking at the benefits that are there through employment, otherwise to the entire country, is one that hopefully I think is beginning to come around a little bit more with this crisis, but I think something that moving forward we'd see more across the board. Having looked at perhaps the external point, how we can access markets, what about turning inwards to Sri Lanka itself? What kind of barriers does an exporter face? For example, yes, exporters with the know-how, perhaps the larger exporters who've been in the game for a while has it. But what about SMEs or MSMEs who are trying to enter into this export arena? Do they face any barriers in terms of the regulations, licensing procedures, in terms of entering this? Perhaps even with maybe the lack of information on how to kind of go about it.
So I think you're right. I think where a new company coming in will struggle is to find their way. And we do have places like the BOI and the EDB and so on who are there to to serve the exporter, and the EDB in particular kind of focuses on the smaller individual exporters, and somebody can actually go to them and say, look, hey, I'm trying to do this, give me a hand. I think certainly, and again, I can only speak for apparel, the trade associations play a role there in terms of educating members and helping them navigate the pathway. I fully agree, for a bigger, well-established company, things run smoothly. The difficulty, I think, comes also as companies try to make that transition from being a local supplier to being an exporter, because a lot of the process and so on is geared for companies who are predominantly export companies. If a company is predominantly a local supplier and is trying to get into a new segment of exporting, it can be difficult, and that's where I think bureaucracy and red tape in our part of the world is, as it is in in other countries in this part of the world, it can be challenging, and I think that hand-holding and navigating process is needed. On that, though, I think the one piece that we do need to look at doing something is particularly around digitalization, and we're very glad to see some positive moves in this, because during COVID, one of the lessons we learned was how we could do all of this electronically. You didn't have to have people running up and down to this department to get a rubber stamp and somewhere else. So this move to accept digital signatures, to be able to file your documentation online, is something that we really feel is useful, because it's going to improve the traceability. It's going to improve the ability to get hold of information, because it's all real time, it's online. And it would just make things easier for all exporters, large or small, because you take away from that element, as I said, of we have factories who are based out of Colombo, and they would have to have somebody in Colombo running with documents from one place to the other. And we've got to move beyond that. So yeah, I think that whole digitalization of both the process for imports and exports, even in terms of Sri Lanka's ease of doing business, it's an area that is of concern. And if we can send out the right signals and say, yes, this is how we are going to facilitate trade, this is how we're going to make it easier for the exporter and the importer to operate, then that sends the right signal in terms of, this is a country that's serious about opening its doors and actually having a flow of trade in and out.
Yeah, I think that digitalization point is quite relevant in today's day and age as well. And we've seen it, I think, even with Sri Lanka kind of ratifying the trade facilitation agreement. I think there was the online, the trade information portal, there were moves. But of course, I think there's always room for improvement. One particular point I just want to follow up in the same theme of like red tape, taking times in kind of customs procedures, the processing, all of that. Do exporters generally face like undue delays? How does that kind of work?
Again, I think for the established exporter who everybody knows what they're doing, generally we don't find a major issue. There are isolated incidents where somebody's shipment gets held up for some bizarre reason, but these tend to be few and far between. I have to say that from a customs point of view, by and large, the process works quite smoothly. We can take cargo out of the port immediately on arrival. We can get, shipments to the airport or the port. Quite often, some of these are running quite late, and you're kind of rushing to meet deadlines and so on. And generally, I would say, in the grand scheme of things, it's not an issue. Customs has its green channel facility as well, which also helps. So yeah, as I say, you will always have that odd occasion where somebody's shipment, didn't come out for some reason. But these tend to be few and far between, and tend not to be from a structural point. It's just, somebody wasn't there to sign a document kind of thing. So, it's that sort of process. But I think generally, again, for the established exporter, I think the issue again will come in terms of some, I guess also customs, knows who the regular importers, exporters are. They have a good, they see shipments coming in and out. They know what they're doing. Somebody's exporting something for the first time, customs may want to look at it a little bit closer to kind of understand. So I think these are some of the growing pains that you go through.
So I think the next kind of area I just want to touch upon was the current situation. We've had kind of a lot of instability politically and economically. Then there are reforms started coming. You have the tax changes, then also the talks about privatization. At the same time, you have these electricity cuts. Kind of looking at the macroeconomic overview, how has this in the last couple of years and also moving forward, how has this kind of affected the various exporters? Has it posed extra barriers? Has it have exporters had to work around to get around it, to overcome it? What has been your experience there?
So if we take the last sort of year and a half or so, one of our biggest issues was the ability to keep factories running, and this kind of rolls back to the pandemic time, and even at that time, the ability to kind of keep the port open, to keep exporters operating and so on. We've got a lot of support from government authorities to make this happen. But I think talking more recently, the biggest challenge, particularly over the time when we were having extended power cuts and so on, was the availability of fuel, and again, in the fuel crisis time and so on. So I think again, this is a sign of how quickly some people do react in these times of crisis, and this ability for exporters to use dollars to pay for diesel and buy diesel in bulk. So when this all went off, immediately that was a problem because a lot of people didn't have the facilities in place, they didn't have storage tanks. But the industry moved very quickly to kind of build its own storage in-house, the ability to use its foreign currency to buy directly from CPC or LIOC really helped to keep things moving along. The ones that we, from an industry point of view, the one that we're really looking forward to is the reform of the CB Act and the ISRA, which is hopefully due imminently. Because there's one particular piece, and that the industry is keen to pursue, and that's this concept of power wheeling, which under the new act will be allowed, which essentially allows a company to set up its own power generation. For example, you have a factory in an area that's not particularly good for solar. You can set up your solar in an area where it's really good for solar, and you effectively use the power you generate yourself. You pay the CEB for the transmission, and then that keeps you kind of independent. So that concept of power wheeling, which is coming in terms of the new Electricity Act, is something that we really are pushing strongly. Number of reasons. One is obviously with the increasing prices. Currently Sri Lanka is just about competitive in dollar terms with our competitors. Another, 30, 40, 50, 60% hike will just put Sri Lanka out of kilter with competitors. So the ability, if we could move to power wheeling, what that will do is it'll encourage people to kind of effectively go off grid and become completely independent. And what that does is that also then takes off the load from the CB, which then reduces the CB's overall generation cost, because we're currently the last bits are being generated at what's exceedingly high rates. So that ability for us to take power out, take our need out of the system will also lower the overall demand, which in turn will then mean CB can function at a lower price, which means better for the customer. So all of these things will start happening, and the sooner we can get these in process. So that's one that we're really awaiting. I think again the opening up of CPC or the Department of Petroleum, allowing more players in there. I mean, we really do need a third player in there to be able to bring competition in, to bring the level of service, to bring all of that in. So yeah, I think those are the big ones that we're really working on, and really can't wait for the electricity ones to happen because those are well overdue. It's something we've been asking for a long time.
Yeah, I think that concept of power wheeling really makes a lot of sense in the present crisis and the situation. So I think we all hope that those kind of reforms kind of will get pushed forward eventually.
I think so. And again, the added point in that is that all of those investments will be in renewable and green power. Now, that's again another massive benefit for us, because the country has certain goals to meet on generation of power, which we're just not on track to meet right now. We as the apparel industry also have our own set, you have targets for generation of electricity that are put on you from brands and so on. And this could really become a key selling point for Sri Lanka and give us another arrow in our thing to say, look, this is what, we're independent, we're generating a much larger amount of power. That's all renewable sources. So again, there's just so many things that will come from that, which just are all the right things to be doing and will also have an impact on benefiting the consumer.
Yeah, I think the last point you made also, like your consumer, especially in the UK, you becoming more aware of this, looking more into, I think you was talking about like carbon border adjustment taxes, all of that. So in the long game, that's definitely something that most of our manufacturers will need to look at. And also that just got me thinking, playing into that, would there be opportunities for, let's say, FDI inflows, because we are looking at possibly large capital investments to get this kind of renewable energy and also the know-how and the tech in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on both points, the know-how and the tech is a big piece. And the moment we open this up, so therefore, the moment we open it up to be effectively to allow somebody else to come in, and if somebody comes in and says to the private sector, right, we're going to do this investment, this is the power we're going to give it, we're going to commit to you for X many years, sign on the dotted line, absolutely. So it'll open up the FDIs and it'll move the technology, because right now we can see how this is shifting. We can see how more efficient solar panels are getting, how, all of this. And if you allow people to come in and play in that sector, you will definitely see the benefits.
Moving to perhaps a more controversial topic, I think something that has been in the discussion in the media is about this idea that there's been misinvoicing, exporters are not bringing back the dollars. In your experience, I think the central bank governor, in fact, came out yesterday or today and said, look, after we put the mechanism in, there's like almost been 100% repatriation. But from experience in the field, what exactly is the ground story? Because I think a lot of these things, sometimes people see some amount like just recorded or reported somewhere, international report, without looking perhaps at the sources, everything. You get that number, you get it spun around. What's your perspective kind of on this whole issue?
So, couple of things. I mean, the first is, and you're right. There are articles which talk of huge money, and fundamentally you need to stop and think. If you're a businessman and you're running your business, can you actually afford to keep a large part of your money? Let's just say in fixed deposit. Let's not say, right. Can you put 50%, 60% of your earnings in fixed deposit and run your business? Yeah, the answer is no. And the governor was also quite clear on how this, but. Let's wind this back a step and let me just explain to you what the process is. So the regulations of the country are that when an exporter exports apparel, that exporter will raise a custec. That custec will have a CIF or a FOB or a CIF price on that. And those numbers are the numbers that get accumulated up into our total exports of 5 billion. Now, by law, once those exports go, you have 180 days within which you have to bring the money back. It's not optional. So the argument that somebody says, well, no, they keep the money outside, you can't. You would bring it back. In the last year and a half or so, government then brought in regulations that said when you bring the monies in, if you take month one, whatever money comes in month one, you have to kind of identify what your authorized debits are going to be. So you can flag up that you have to pay for these raw materials, you have to pay this dividend, you have to pay this loan. Whatever your foreign currency requirements are, you highlight that to the bank. And basically then the balance money has to get converted on the 7th day of the following month. Now that's actually a bank process. And what the banks do is on the 7th day, will just automatically convert it. So since that regulation came in, the amount that you had to convert was actually not negotiable. You just at the end of that, the 7th day, they said, yep, that's what it is. We're going to convert it. And I think there's a lot of conflation in people's mind between repatriation of export proceeds and conversion. These are two completely different concepts. So if I do my exports for $1,000, I am due to get $1,000 from the buyer. That's repatriation of export income. When I bring that in, I then use that money to purchase raw materials, which some might be imported, some might be bought locally, and then the balance I convert. So that's the conversion. So I think people have got these two concepts confused a little bit, and it's quite clear that we need to establish that. What the central bank governor said, and as you rightly said, in the last few days, he's been been clarified it quite a bit. It's not an easy exercise to actually follow because, for example, in addition to the raw materials which we import from overseas, we also make a number of raw material purchases from local, what we call deemed exporters. So a BOI company that set up manufacturing fabric that sells to a fabric exporter, that's what's referred to a deemed export, and the exporter has to pay them in dollars because that they actually can't pay them in local currency. That's law. So if when the exporter gets his remittances in, yes, he will pay. Some will go straight out of the country. Some will go to another company within the country in foreign exchange. So you need and that amount can be quite significant. So we did about, if we say 5 billion exports last year, the amount of purchases from local deemed exporters was over $1 billion. So it's not an insignificant amount. So if you want to trace the amount that's converted, you actually have to pull this thread to say, fine, this is what the company converted directly. They then paid, for example, $500 to buy fabric. Well, what did that fabric manufacturer do with that? How much raw material did he do? How much did he convert? And part of this problem that's come up is that there hasn't been a monitoring mechanism that has been in place. It's gone in shifts. It's shifted from one to the other. I think sometime in 21 there was a requirement that companies had to file with the BOI. It was gazetted, and you had to file with the BOI every month what your exports were and what your remittances are in. And the issue is that, unfortunately, the way all of this works, there's no central collating of it. And this was the piece that the governor was making, point he was making, is that since they put their monitoring mechanism in and actually were able to pull that thread, they've been able to establish two key things. One is that exporters do bring the money in. And secondly, that when the conversion, you have to go to the second stage of what was converted. So I think that's where they're at. And from our position, we are categoric that our membership absolutely abides by the law, both in respect of the inward remittances and then the subsequent conversions. If you were to say to me, what's the actual conversion? It's a difficult one to say because you need to then go for example, you have a BOI company that does washing of garments. So you pay them in dollars. Then you have to go to them and say, right, what raw materials did you buy in dollars and what have you converted? So it's a complicated process. And I think what the monitoring mechanism that the CBSL has put in is suddenly found it, gosh, it's not as easy as you might think. So, yeah, and as I said, at the end of the day, if anybody is in a business that allows you to, as I say, take even 20% of your revenue and put it away somewhere and run on 80%, it's just not possible. You cannot run, if you did one export transaction in your life and you didn't bring that money back, yeah, well, that's good for you. But we're all businesses that have an ongoing business that operates. So I think there's a lot of confusion around this and people kind of jumping at the wrong end of the stick. So it's important to kind of lay that out.
I think that brings a lot of clarity to the issue. I think when you have big numbers thrown around, a lot of people start getting confused, assuming things. But I think that explanation kind of clarifies exactly what the process and what goes behind the number you see on paper. I just want to go back to one thing you mentioned at the beginning about the need to, while we maintain our successful markets where we have advantage, also looking at diversification. So could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on that? One, in terms of, do we have other products, other kind of exposed to diversify? And also within the sectors that we are, do we need to upscale in terms of bringing tech in, kind of upscale into maybe higher value products, higher value added products? And if so, what are are there any reforms that are needed, any barriers that are faced in that context?
So I think in terms of, and again, my sort of area is apparel, so I can't speak for other things. I think, but if I take a broader picture, we have to identify what we're good at as a country. What are the products that we know we can export, which is going to give us some competitive advantage so they become sustainable? Obviously, there's a whole range of agro products. There's the cinnamons, the spices, the teas, all of that, where we have the fact that we have the product growing locally. If you take apparel, what's happened over the years is that what we've done over the last few years is we've actually widened the offer that we make to customers. And this is in terms of value addition by way of process. So, for example, there's design, there's product development, there's innovation, all of that's offered to the customer. So what we say is when you're buying a garment, you're actually not just buying, the manufacturing piece, but you're actually going further down the whole value chain. and saying we'll design it for you, we'll work with fabric mills and develop the product, the fabric if you like. We'll have our product development teams look at cost engineering so we can bring this in. We'll use 3D technology to do fitting to speed the process up. So there's a lot that's done under the value addition piece that is not in terms of value addition as you might traditionally think of it in terms of, what more can I input into the shirt? Because if you look at the shirt we're wearing, how much more can you add value? There's not a huge deal of demand for embroidered and, shirts for work. So I think within the product itself, it's difficult. But what we've done is actually widen the offer of what we're doing, including, warehousing. Sri Lanka's extremely well placed from a logistics point of view. It's extremely well located, whether it's to Europe or to the US, not far from raw material sources. So whether it's a case of, warehousing for customers, and there's a lot of that happens here where we have warehousing, we have pick and pack type services. So there's value addition in terms of the offer of the product. And that tends to kind of make it sustainable in terms of making it grow. I think the one area that, as we're talking, will come up is, of course, there's a lot of debate about liberalization in the shipping area, and that's an area which we are absolutely keen that happens because we don't see the justification for restrictions on ownership in these areas. They're not sensitive areas, and we should allow that to be fully liberalized so that we can actually make Sri Lanka the logistics hub that we want it to be. We have the location, we have the ports, we have the facilities. We just need a little bit of flex on that.
I think there's some unique perspectives, especially in terms of the value addition you brought in. I think with coming to end, I'd like to pose maybe just one more question. If, let's say, magically, you could implement one reform tomorrow, one change, what would that be?
Oh, gosh. I suppose it's actually a change of mind, I think, rather than, it's the opening of the fact that, for Sri Lanka to recover, there is no doubt merchandise exports have to grow by a significant amount. And whatever that implies in terms of particularly the whole approach to FTAs, the opening up of the market, we have to break away from the reform. It's a reform of the mindset that says actually opening up to the world is a two-way street and we can all benefit, whether we're a local manufacturer or whether we're an exporter. And I think if we break that mindset, the rest of it will all kind of, will happen. The ease of doing business, the speeding up of processes, the opening up of shipping, everything else will come if we have the right mindset to this, which is that, for us to grow, we have to play on the world stage. And that's a two-way street. We can't be there and say, yes, but. So I think, for me, it's actually a reform of the mind.
I think that's a brilliant answer. Thanks again, Yohan. I think you've really given us a good insight into what the state it is, why we need to kind of focus on this, and some of the steps that can be taken. Any final thoughts you'd just like to share?
No, I think Sri Lanka is making the right progress. I think we have to focus on, as you put rightly said, even the smaller roadblocks that there are, the things that are going to give us an ease of doing business. We really have to be that place where somebody who is looking to invest in Sri Lanka says, yes, I want to go into Sri Lanka, not I'm forced to go there for this reason or that reason. We want for Sri Lanka to be that preferred destination for FDIs, whatever that FDI is, to be honest. So that's the goal.
Great. Thanks again for your time. And thank you everyone for listening and watching the Reset Now podcast. See you again on the next episode.
You can listen to this podcast on Anchor, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember to follow us on all our social media platforms for more exciting content. See you in the next episode.